Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 6 of my series on the Mexican Revolution, The 10 Tragic Days. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, the first few months of Francisco Madero's presidency had been uneven. Financed by the Terraza Creole faction, former revolutionary hero Pazqual Orozco had revolted but was defeated by an army led by General Victoriano Huerta, aided by Pancho Villa. However, Madero had failed to negotiate a peaceful solution with Emiliano Zapata, and the federal army was unable to restore stability in Morelos. Worse, the Terraza Creole faction, which dominated Chihuahua, had not been punished for their support of Orozco and had made friends with Huerta, which did not bode well for Madero in the future. Having quashed rebellions led by Bernardo Reyes, Felix Diaz, and Orozco, Madero's position should have been secure, but the opposite was true. The Porfirians had realized that they needed to unite behind a single leader, and General Mondragon had helped to bridge the gap between the Reyistas and the Felicistas, the supporters of Felix Diaz. That hard work paid off on February 9th when troops led by Mondragon seized the prison holding Reyes and Diaz. Since both men had rebelled, they should have been executed, but Madero was too squeamish to permit the execution of gentlemen. Actually, the coup was a desperate gamble since few officers would commit to the plot until concrete action had been taken. Although Huerta had been a follower of Reyes, he had refused to join the plot, likely because he had come to enjoy the spotlight as the general who had vanquished Orozco and was unwilling to return to a supporting role. Reyes intended to announce his new regime at the National Palace, but the garrison resisted, and Reyes was killed. The remaining rebel troops retreated to a citadel within the city, but Diaz's chances for survival were slim. Since the general who had led the ambush of Reyes had been badly wounded, Huerta was given command of the loyalist troops. Madero had never fully trusted Huerta and planned to replace him as soon as possible, but General Felipe Angeles, his chosen replacement, lacked the backbone needed to face down Huerta. Former interim President de Ibarra does not seem to have been involved in the coup and offered to negotiate, but Mondragon and Diaz refused anything other than Madero's resignation, which Madero rejected, understandably, since the coup had no national support. After a standoff for 2 days, the fighting started again on February 11th, and it proved bloody. The artillery duel between the two sides would kill hundreds of civilians. Worried that the coup might fail, American Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson persuaded the foreign ministers of Britain, Spain, and Germany to issue a joint call for Madero to step down in order to end the bloodshed. However, the ambassadors of other nations, including Austria, Japan, Cuba, Brazil, and Chile, refused to support the announcement. Wilson's involvement may seem strange, but the ambassador hated Madero with a surprising passion and had repeatedly lobbied Washington to intervene to defend American interests in Mexico. American opposition to Madero's regime had grown rapidly, so President Taft was not opposed to a regime change. Unknown to Madero, Diaz and Huerta were only pretending to fight, while Huerta sent loyal forces to be killed in futile charges against Diaz's machine guns. Discovering that Huerta had allowed supplies to reach Diaz's forces, Madero's brother Gustavo arrested Huerta on February 17th, but once again, Madero believed Huerta, accepting his promise that he would end the coup within 24 hours. The next day, Huerta kept his promise by arresting Madero, General Angeles, Gustavo Madero, and the entire cabinet. Madero had been president for a little over 3 months. There was only one presidential chair, but Huerta and Diaz each wanted to sit in it, so Ambassador Wilson presided over a meeting between the two rivals at the American embassy. Since Huerta had captured the government and made it clear that he would not back down, he would have the presidency while the Felicistas would choose the members of the cabinet. a key part of the pact was that elections would be held soon, Diaz would be allowed to run, and he would be backed by Huerta. Madero was persuaded to resign on February 19th, 10 days after the beginning of the coup, which is why it is called the 10 Tragic Days. Ambassador Wilson told President Taft that Huerta had agreed to let Madero go into exile in Cuba, and the Cuban ambassador later confirmed that he had taken part in meetings with Wilson to arrange Madero's safe passage out of Mexico. Instead, Madero and Vice President Suarez were taken out of prison at night and executed, which transformed a reluctant revolutionary into a martyr. Huerta denied involvement, but it seems impossible to have happened without his orders, especially since Madero's brother Gustavo had already been murdered while in military custody. It is worth asking, would Madero have been a good president if he had survived the coup? Honestly, probably not. While he had won election by a huge margin, he basically ran without serious opposition. Admittedly, he had defeated several revolts, but Zapata remained defiant, the Terraza clan was still influential, and his control over the federal army was weak. Most important, he had few practical plans, so people would have likely become disillusioned, and a weak central government would have struggled to impose its authority across the nation. Disgusted by the events, one of Woodrow Wilson's first acts as president was to recall Ambassador Wilson. He also called on Huerta to resign as president and hold free elections. President Wilson's criticism of the coup was surprising, since the United States had not made any criticism about the overthrow of Porfiro Diaz and had had friendly relations with numerous Latin American dictators. Although puzzled by the new American president's comments, Huerta's immediate task was to restore stability. The prognosis was initially favorable, since Orozco formally allied with Huerta, even though the two men had been trying to kill each other a few months earlier. Despite his claims of wanting land reform, Orozco still repeatedly allied with reactionary forces. He even sent his father to try to persuade Zapata to join Huerta, but Zapata responded by executing him. Aside from Orozco, Huerta had other supporters. Part of a leading family in the Veracruz region, Manuel Pelez, had initially fought for Madero against Diaz, but soon ended ties with Madero, annoyed that his men were demobilized after Diaz's resignation. He supported Felix Diaz's first revolt and then fled to the U.S. after Diaz was captured. When Madero fell, Pelez supported Huerta and raised troops to maintain order in Veracruz. Admittedly, an offer of amnesty was accepted by many guerrillas, but the sudden peace was an illusion, since guerrilla chieftains would return to fighting if they felt they had not been properly rewarded by the government. Since Zapata had been in revolt through several regime changes, his continued resistance was probably not a shock. However, Huerta had not anticipated that Madero, an unpopular president, would prove to be an extremely popular martyr who inspired uprisings all over Mexico. The new revolution would be bloodier than the previous one because everyone had seen that Madero's attempted compromise in order to keep the basic structure of society intact had been a miserable failure. This revolution would be to the death. A key opponent was Venustiano Carranza, governor of Coahuila. Madero had rewarded Carranza's support during the revolution by backing his campaign for governor in the November 1911 election. Fixated on the past, especially Benito Juarez, Carranza was not a true radical like Zapata, but he was willing to restrict the elite's economic privileges to provide more economic opportunities for the majority of the population. Therefore, he had been a vocal critic of Madero's compromise with Diaz loyalists, predicting that a revolution that made concessions was committing suicide. Allergic to bullets, Governor Maturana of Sonora had taken an extended vacation in the United States, and Governor Gonzalez of Chihuahua had already been killed by federal troops, so Carranza was the sole remaining political leader in the North. Claiming that Huerta had violated the Mexican Constitution of 1857, Carranza formed the constitutionalist movement, which would restore the Constitution and hopefully make him president of Mexico. While he did not have an infectious charisma, Carranza's height, age, and bearing gave him the appearance of a leader, and he continuously acted as if the other leaders had naturally recognized his authority. However, 3 major defeats proved that he was a better politician than general. Abandoning Coahuila, he fled to Sonora, which had a larger revolutionary army and was more secure since it did not have a direct rail link to Mexico City. While the northern rebels in Sonora, Coahuila, and Chihuahua became loosely organized under the constitutionalist banner and attracted former maderista chieftains, not everyone who rose up against Huerta was a Madero supporter. Frustrated that Madero had made no effort to improve the lives of the rural lower and middle class, the Cedillo family had led a revolt against Madero in San Luis Potosi in support of Zapata. It soon became clear that Huerta had even less interest in agrarian reform than Madero, so the Cedillos continued their revolt. While Huerta struggled to restore stability, Diaz was busy handing out rewards to his followers. With Reyes dead, the Reyistas naturally gravitated to Diaz, therefore he should have been well positioned to win the election that would undoubtedly be held once Huerta had restored order. Although his platform made no mention of workers' rights or agrarian reform, he did pledge to limit himself to a single term. Months later, it became clear that Huerta had grown comfortable in the presidential palace and had no intention of moving out. The longer Huerta delayed elections, the weaker Diaz appeared, and his support steadily evaporated. Recognizing that Huerta was the man with the power, many Porfirians switched their allegiance to Huerta, who had been slowly replacing Felicistas with Huertistas. Every time Huerta removed a Felicista and Diaz made no reaction, Huerta grew bolder until he arranged the ouster of General Mondragon as Minister of War. Finally, Diaz accepted the position of envoy to Japan in order to be as far away from Huerta as humanly possible. Unlike Porfiro Diaz, who had been both a governor and a general before becoming president, Huerta's life had been shaped by the army. As president, he spent his time surrounded by military men, inspecting troops during the day, and drinking with old soldiers at night. Viewing politicians as parasites, he treated them like junior officers who were expected to follow orders. Therefore, it should not come as a surprise that he attracted little, if any, political support. Aside from the first few months of his regime, when people genuinely hoped for a return to Porfirian stability. While Porfiro Diaz had relied on a mixture of stability and political repression, Huerta only offered blunt repression and swiftly demolished the fragile political liberalism that had been established during the Madero regime. Faced with a powerful revolution, Huerta responded by transforming Mexico into a military state, inflating the army to 200,000 men by seizing thousands of men as conscripts, depriving factories and businesses of labor. His press gangs were so relentless that young people did not dare to leave their homes after dark. Despite pressure from large business interests in the United States to recognize Huerta's regime, President Wilson adopted a policy of watchful waiting that included neutrality in the growing civil war and an arms embargo on both Huerta and the rebels. The number of rebels now included Pancho Villa. Yes, he had been in prison after he was accused of desertion by Huerta following the end of the campaign against Orozco. Madero had been leaning towards pardoning him, but he escaped on Christmas Day 1912 and made his way to El Paso, Texas. Even though Madero had basically left him to rot in prison for months, Villa still resolved to avenge him. Only 8 followers rode with him when he crossed the Rio Grande to return to Mexico on March 13th. Hoping to attract attention, Villa targeted haciendas, where he would kill the owner and the manager and then open the granaries to the peons. This strategy attracted many recruits. By the end of May, Villa had 700 disciplined troops, while Orozco had inflicted a number of defeats on the other guerrilla bands. So they accepted Villa's leadership, calling their army the Division of the North. Villa planned a careful campaign until he felt ready for a direct attack against Torreon Coahuila, the hub of the railway system. Most of the federal forces were conscripts, so the commander abandoned his post after a nighttime attack on October 1st, gave Villa control of the federal artillery. Despite the victory, Huerta refused to worry, thinking that Villa could not keep his army together. Needing a victory, Villa filled a train with troops and bluffed his way to Ciudad Juarez on November 15th by claiming to be a federal commander who could not move south because the tracks had been destroyed by guerrillas. Allowed to roll into the city at night, he captured the city without a fight. This feat made him famous, and control of Juarez enabled the direct supply of weapons and ammunition. The victory spread fear through the state, and the Terraza Creel faction fled across the border along with General Orozco. Instead of rejoicing in the victory, Carranza resented the success of Villa, who was willing to recognize Carranza as head of the revolution, but would not accept interference in his region. Wanting his own general, Carranza selected Alvaro Obregon, who had grown up relatively well off. Possessing a quick mind and a near-perfect memory, he made a decent living but became very aware of the indignities of the laborers' lives. Unlike almost all of the major leaders of the revolution, he had only started his military career after Porfiro Diaz had been defeated, raising a battalion to defend Sonora during Orozco's initial revolt. Despite his lack of previous military training, Obregon was a natural leader and careful planner, so he was rapidly promoted. Obregon soon evicted Huerta's forces from Sonora, and he had an army of 6,000 men by the summer. After two large federal armies were lured into meticulously planned traps and destroyed, Carranza appointed him commander of the Army of the Northwest in September. While he had chosen an effective military commander, Carranza unfortunately shared Madero's preference for well-dressed, well-educated young men rather than the hard-bitten revolutionaries who were doing the actual fighting. Carranza established a government in waiting that resembled a medieval court, since each minister had numerous aides and secretaries, while factions within the court schemed to gain more influence with Carranza. One key faction failed to carve out a place in Carranza's government, namely Madero's former advisors, as if he was repelled by their association with failure. Tiring of the cool reception, many leading maderistas, including Felipe Angeles and several members of Madero's family, left Sonora and made their way to Villa's camp in Chihuahua. They wanted a counterweight to Carranza's pomposity, and Villa needed them to administer his territory. While Villa was an authoritarian figure with little patience for dissent, part of him recognized that he lacked the ability to lead a national revolt. Meanwhile, Huerta had abandoned any claim to legitimacy. When Congress passed a motion calling for an official investigation into the murder of a senator, Huerta simply arrested 74 members of the legislature in October. He then blatantly rigged the election for a new Congress and the presidential election, portraying himself as a write-in candidate who had to serve as president, since it was the will of the people, even though he was constitutionally banned from serving, since he was already the interim president. Most of the parties simply boycotted the election. Although voter turnout was dismal, Huerta was able to swear in a pliable cabinet made up of relatives and cronies. To sum up, Huerta had overthrown Madero and then driven his supposed ally Felix Diaz into exile, finally declaring himself president. But the revolt against him, led by Carranza, was growing. I will discuss that revolt, including Zapata's actions in Morelos and the American occupation of Veracruz, next episode. Thanks for listening.